A 3-year-old girl stands on an auction block in the middle of a Wyoming town square, barefoot, bruised, clutching a rabbit with one ear missing. The auctioneer calls out her age like he's selling a goat. The crowd watches, shifting, muttering, some with pity, most with nothing at all. Nobody raises a hand, nobody steps forward, the child does not cry. She has already learned that crying changes nothing. Then one man pushes through the crowd. If you've ever believed that a single decision can rewrite a life, stay with me until the very end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Brennan Holt rode into Iron Hollow, he was thinking about a horse. That was all he had on his mind. A bay gelding he'd heard about from a livestock trader named Cutter Walsh, supposedly sound-legged, good-tempered, and priced fair for a man watching every dollar. Brennan had made the ride from his ranch before sunrise, the kind of early that's more night than morning, following the creek road south with nothing but the sound of his own horse's hooves and the occasional complaint of a coyote somewhere out in the dark grass. He wasn't expecting a crowd, but Iron Hollow had one, thick and restless by the time he tied his horse at the rail outside the feed store and walked toward the noise. It was a Saturday, which usually meant market trading, and the smell of the town confirmed it. Sawdust, manure, fry bread from the widow Eckhart's cart near the corner. But this wasn't the ordinary Saturday shuffle of ranchers and merchants talking over grain prices and harness leather. The crowd was gathered in the open square near the old land office, pressed together in a tight, uncomfortable knot, and the quality of the noise coming out of it wasn't the easy back and forth of commerce. It was lower than that, harder to name. Brennan worked his way to the edge of the crowd, touching the brim of his hat to a man he recognized from the hardware supply. A broad-shouldered German named Peter Voss, who ran a small homestead 8 miles east. "What's this?" Brennan asked. Voss didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the platform in the center of the square. A rough plank stage, the kind they hauled out for public notices and occasional entertainment. "County?" Voss said flatly. "Orphan situation." Brennan turned to look. The man standing on the platform wore a brown town coat, slightly too large for him, with a badge pinned crookedly to his lapel that identified him as a county officer of some variety. He had the tired, put-upon expression of a man who dealt in paperwork and considered whatever he was currently doing an unfortunate deviation from paperwork. Beside him stood a woman from the county office who held a ledger, her face blank and professional, like a woman who had learned that the best way to do this particular job was to feel as little of it as possible. And next to her, on that rough plank stage, stood a child. Brennan almost missed her at first. She was so small, genuinely small, the kind of small that made you recalibrate what 3 years of life actually looked like on a human body. She wore a dress that had been white once, and was now the color of old dishwater, gone thin at the shoulders and too short by 4 inches. Her feet were bare despite the gravel surface of the square. Her hair had been cut close to her skull with what appeared to be blunt scissors, unevenly, and her face, what Brennan could see of it from 30 feet back, was tipped downward, chin toward her chest, focused on the one thing she held in her arms, a stuffed rabbit, soft gray, with one ear gone and the remaining ear hanging by a thread. The county officer cleared his throat and spoke in a carrying voice. "All right, folks. This here's the last item of business for this morning's proceedings. Child is female, approximate age 3 years, no verified birth record, transferred from the Harwick County Charity House following the passing of the house matron and the subsequent closure of that facility. No family has come forward to claim her. The county is seeking placement." Someone near Brennan, a woman in a calico bonnet, said to her companion, "What's the arrangement then?" Her companion, a man with a sun-peeled nose, shrugged. "Indenture, I'd expect. Or the new institutional house over in Caldwell. They take them young enough." "She's awful small for indenture." "They're not asking her opinion." The county officer continued. "Any parties interested in taking the child into their household for purposes of labor placement or formal indenture may approach. The county has established a modest placement fee of—" Brennan stopped listening. He was looking at the child's feet. They were not just bare, they were bruised across the arches, the kind of bruising that didn't come from walking on gravel. It came from something deliberate. And there on her left calf, just visible below the hem of the dress, was a discoloration that was too dark and too uniform to be ordinary childhood scraping. The crowd around him was doing the usual math. Too young to be useful for another 4 or 5 years? And who knows what kind of trouble she'll be in the meantime. Caldwell House is probably the right place. They know how to manage. Seems a shame, but what can you do? Brennan looked at the woman with the ledger. She was writing something, not looking at the child. The county officer was scanning the crowd with the weary expression of a man checking boxes. And the child on the platform had not moved, had not looked up, had not made a sound. She was not crying. That was the thing that did it, if Brennan was honest with himself later. Not the bruises, not the bare feet, not even the sorry state of the stuffed rabbit. It was the fact that she was not crying. Because a child that young, standing on a platform in front of strangers while men debated her worth in audible tones, that child should have been screaming, should have been reaching for someone, should have been doing any of the things children do when they are frightened and alone. But she had already learned. That was what her stillness said. She had already learned that reaching didn't bring anyone, and crying didn't stop anything, and the best you could do was hold your rabbit and wait for whatever came next. Brennan Holt was 34 years old. He had never married. He ran a cattle operation that was modest at best and stubborn at worst, 640 acres of Wyoming grass that he'd inherited from his father, and spent the last 12 years trying to make produce more than it naturally wanted to. He had no particular plan for children, had not thought about children in any serious way, had barely thought about anything that morning beyond the bay gelding. He pushed through the crowd. "I'll take her." The words came out before he'd fully decided to say them, which was how he'd know later that it was the right thing. Not because it felt certain, but because the decision was already made before his brain caught up with it. The county officer stared at him. The woman with the ledger looked up from her writing for the first time. "Sir," the officer said, "there is a placement fee." "How much?" $42, which covers— "I have 57. Brennan reached into his coat, pulled out the billfold he'd brought for the horse. "Take what you need." A murmur moved through the crowd. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the child who had finally, slightly, lifted her head, not looking at him directly, looking at his boots. He had the sense she was measuring something, the size of him maybe, or the distance. "Sir, I'll need you to sign several forms, and there are conditions of the placement arrangement that— I'll sign whatever you need." He came up to the edge of the platform and stopped. He didn't reach for the child. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct told him reaching would be wrong. "What's her name?" The officer consulted his ledger. The Harwick house listed her as Mira. No surname recorded. Mira. The child's chin dropped again slightly. He wasn't sure if she'd heard. Wasn't sure if she recognized the word as her name, or if she'd heard it used so rarely that it no longer registered. "All right," Brennan said, more to the child than the officer, though he kept his voice even, not soft in the performing way, just quiet. "My name's Brennan. I have a ranch north of here. There's a room." She didn't answer. She didn't look up. He signed the papers. Boy, the ride back to the ranch took the better part of 3 hours, and Mira spent most of it sitting in front of him on the saddle, rigid as a fence post, as far forward as the saddle horn would allow. She held the rabbit with both arms across her chest like a shield. She did not lean back. She did not sleep. Every time his horse shifted rhythm or stumbled slightly on the uneven road, she gripped the saddle horn with one hand and didn't make a sound. Brennan talked, after a while. Not because he expected anything back. He was a man who'd spent enough time alone to be comfortable with his own silence, and he understood she wasn't going to answer him. He talked because the quiet seemed like the wrong kind of quiet, the held breath kind, and he thought maybe sound that wasn't demanding anything of her would be less frightening than nothing at all. He told her about this ranch, the 2 creek-fed pastures, the small herd of cattle, 23 head at last count, including a calf born 3 weeks ago that had immediately established itself as the most difficult animal on the property. He told her about the dog, a cattle dog named Soot, on account of his coloring, who had opinions about everyone and shared them freely. He told her Agnes Holloway had been keeping the house since before Brennan inherited it, and that Agnes made the best biscuits in the county without particularly caring whether anyone thought so, and that she would probably have something hot on the stove when they arrived. Mira listened, or didn't. He couldn't tell. When they came down the last rise and the ranch came into view, the main house, the barn, the fence lines running away into the grass, Brennan felt for the first time the full weight of what he had done. He was a single man. He knew cattle and fence wire and weather patterns. He did not know the first practical thing about caring for a 3-year-old child, let alone one who had clearly been through something that went beyond ordinary hardship. He thought, I may have made an extraordinary mistake. And then he thought, well, too late now. Agnes was on the porch when they rode in. She was a compact woman of 63, with white hair pinned severely at the back of her skull and hands that were permanently stained from years of working with garden soil and tanning leather. She watched Brennan dismount without expression, and then she watched him lift the child carefully from the saddle. Mira went rigid the moment his hands touched her waist, and he made it quick and set her down on the ground and stepped back immediately. And Agnes took in the torn dress and the bare feet and the cut-close hair and the rabbit, and her expression went through 3 or 4 things in rapid succession before settling into something that wasn't quite neutral but was controlled. Mr. Holt, she said. Agnes. You went to buy a horse. I know. A pause. Agnes looked at the child. Mira was standing exactly where Brennan had set her, eyes down, both arms around the rabbit, very still. She have a name? Mira. County records, no surname. Agnes came down the porch steps slowly, not toward Mira, but angled away, toward the side of the steps, giving the child room. She lowered herself to sit on the bottom step, which put her roughly at eye level with the girl, and she said in a voice that was not especially warm, Agnes wasn't a warm woman by nature, but was steady and matter-of-fact. There's bean soup on, and bread. You look like you could stand some. Mira didn't respond. You don't have to, Agnes said. There's no have to about it. She sat there for a moment, then stood up and went back into the house without touching the child or asking anything further. Brennan looked at Mira, who had not moved. She means it, he said. About the soup. The first night was bad. Brennan had put Mira in the small bedroom off the kitchen. It had been used for storage for the better part of a decade, but Agnes had cleared it out that afternoon with a speed and efficiency that suggested she had made her own decision about things without discussing it, and she had put a straw-filled mattress on the low cot frame and a quilt and a candle on the table and a cup of water. He had shown Mira the room. He had said goodnight. He had closed the door. 2 hours later, he woke to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. Not crying, not quite, more like an animal sound, low and rhythmic. He lit the lamp and went down the hall and opened the door. Mira was not in the bed. She was behind it, wedged into the corner where the back of the bed frame met the wall, sitting with her knees drawn up, the rabbit on her knees, making the low rhythmic sound that he now understood was a kind of keening, not loud, not dramatic, just continuous, automatic, like breathing. Her eyes were open. Brennan stood in the doorway and did not go in. He sat down on the floor in the hallway, back against the wall opposite the open door, where she could see him if she looked, and he put the lamp on the floor beside him, and he waited. He didn't say anything. He didn't call to her. He just sat. After a while, the sound stopped. He wasn't sure when she went back to sleep. He fell asleep himself in the hallway, back against the wall, and woke at first light with a stiff neck and the sound of Agnes starting the fire in the kitchen. When he looked into the room, Mira was in the bed. She had moved the mattress off the cot frame and onto the floor, and she was sleeping on it there, curled around the rabbit, her back against the wall. He left her alone and went to start the day. The next 2 weeks were an education in how a child who has learned not to need anything behaves when presented with ordinary kindness. Mira ate. That was the first thing. She ate with the focused, urgent attention of someone who expected the food to disappear, cleaning her bowl completely and then sitting very still, watching the table, as if waiting for someone to take it back. Agnes began leaving a small extra portion, a piece of bread, a boiled egg, at the edge of the table without comment. Within 3 days, Mira began taking it before it could be offered, tucking it somewhere, in her pocket, or into the fold of the rabbit, and they both pretended not to notice. She didn't speak, not a word, not in English, not in any recognizable form of language. She communicated in a small vocabulary of posture and movement, the way she angled her body, the direction of her eyes, the particular quality of her stillness. Brennan, who was by nature an observer, began to learn it, the way you learn a new landscape, slowly, incrementally, by paying attention. She was terrified of raised voices, not just angry voices, any sharp rise in volume. When Brennan argued with the feed supplier over a short delivery and raised his voice in the yard, he found Mira an hour later behind the woodpile, small and unreachable. He made a mental note and worked on keeping his voice flat even when he was frustrated, which required more effort than he'd expected. She was terrified of closed doors. If the kitchen door was shut, she would not come in. If her bedroom door swung shut in the wind, she would not open it herself. She would wait in the hall, sitting on the floor, until Agnes or Brennan came and opened it. They began wedging doors open with pieces of firewood. She was somewhat inexplicably not terrified of the animals. The dog Soot had taken one look at her on the first day and apparently made a decision because he stationed himself near her with the purposeful air of a dog who has found his assignment. He didn't push at her or jump. He just positioned himself in her vicinity and went about being a dog, and within a week she was letting him sit against her leg. The cattle confused and fascinated her. On the fourth day, Brennan found her at the pasture fence, standing on the bottom rail, watching them with complete absorption. He came and stood nearby, and after a while she pointed, a single, deliberate pointing motion, at the calf. "That one's trouble," Brennan said. "Broke out twice already." She looked at him briefly, then back at the calf. "You can name him if you want," he said. "He doesn't have one yet. I've been calling him something Agnes won't repeat." A silence. He wasn't expecting anything. Then, so quietly, he almost missed it. "Bull." It was the first word, just the one. Her voice was rough and unsteady, like something that hadn't been used in a long time. Brennan looked at the calf, which was, in fact, a bull calf. "Bull it is," he said, and did not make a larger deal of it than it was. Nah. Agnes, one evening when Mira was asleep and Brennan was finishing the last of his coffee at the kitchen table, sat down across from him and folded her hands and said, "She's been hit." He looked at his cup. "I know," he said, "not the ordinary sort of hitting." Agnes kept her voice level and factual, which was how she handled things that weren't level or factual inside. "There are marks, old ones, on her back and her legs. I've seen some of them." He hadn't wanted to see them. There had been a night in the first week when Mira had gotten her dress wet from knocking over her water cup, and Agnes had changed her, and Brennan had been in the doorway and had turned away almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. "Whatever that Harwick house was," Agnes said, "it wasn't charity." Brennan set down his cup. "No." "So what are you going to do about it?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The place closed. The matron's dead." Agnes met his eyes steadily. "The place closed, but someone built it, someone funded it, someone signed off on how it operated for however many years it operated, and there are likely other children." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know where to start with something like that," he said. It was honest. "No," Agnes agreed. "Neither do I." A pause. "But I suspect someone does." 3 weeks in, Iron Hollow gave Brennan a first indication that news traveled fast in small territories. He was at the hardware store, picking up wire, when a man came to stand beside him at the counter with the deliberate casualness of someone who wants a conversation but doesn't want to seem to want one. The man was around 50, with a town quality to his clothes and a certain soft quality to his hands that said he didn't do much work with them. "You're the Holt rancher," the man said. "Took the orphan girl." "That's me." "Fielding Crane." He didn't offer a hand. "I'm on the county welfare committee." "All right," Brennan said. "Just want to say, the county appreciates when private citizens step up in these situations." Crane's tone had the texture of someone rehearsing. "We do want to ensure, of course, that the child's circumstances are appropriate, given that you're, an unmarried man, ranching alone." "Agnes Holloway keeps my house," Brennan said. "Has for 15 years. "Yes, yes. Still, the committee does have an obligation to follow up on placements of this kind, particularly given the child's history. The Harwick House was a licensed facility, whatever one might think of its management." Brennan set down the wire spool and looked at Crane directly. "What exactly are you saying?" Crane adjusted his collar. "I'm saying the committee will need to conduct a formal review of the placement. Routine matter, really. These things take time. In the interim..." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that wanted to be casual but wasn't quite. There are established institutions better equipped to handle children of her particular background. The Caldwell facility, for example. She's not going to Caldwell, Brennan said. Crane smiled thinly. Mr. Holt, these decisions aren't really yours to make unilaterally. The county has obligations. I signed the county's paperwork, Brennan said. Paid the county's fee. She's in my placement. He picked up the wire spool. If the committee wants to do a review, they're welcome to come to the ranch. He looked at Crane steadily. Come in the daylight. He went to the counter and paid and left. Outside, he stood for a moment in the heat and looked down the street toward the square where the platform had been. Someone had moved it. Normal Saturday again. He walked back to his horse, and he thought about Agnes's question. Someone built it. And he thought about Fielding Crane's soft hands. And he thought about Mira in the corner behind the bed that first night, making that sound. He tied the wire to his saddle. He was going to need a lawyer. The lawyer he found was named Hattie Gale. He hadn't been looking for a woman attorney, specifically in 1887 Wyoming Territory. A woman attorney was simply what you got when you went to the only attorney in Larimer County who wasn't already in someone else's pocket, which was the condition Brennan understood he needed to satisfy above all others. The man who told him to find Hattie was the blacksmith in Thornfield, a quiet man who had watched Brennan listen to a longer list of recommended lawyers with growing skepticism, and who had finally said, "You want someone who won't sell you out? Find Hattie Gale in Sutter's Crossing. She's got half the ranchers and all the women, and nobody owns her." Hattie Gale was 38, narrow-framed, with ink-stained fingers and a directness that arrived before she finished sitting down. "Tell me the whole thing," she said when Brennan had introduced himself and stated his general situation. "Don't summarize. Summarizing leaves out the parts that matter." He told her the whole thing, including Agnes's observation about the marks on Mira's back, including Fielding Crane. Hattie listened without interrupting, which Brennan appreciated because he'd encountered too many people recently who processed information as a series of things to talk over. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance. "The placement you have is legally tenuous," she said finally. "The county auction method is irregular. It's been challenged before, though not successfully, because no one has pushed it past the first objection. So Crane can have her taken back." "He can try. What he wants is a little more complicated." She looked at him sharply. "You understand that the Harwick facility didn't operate in isolation. Facilities like that have funding, oversight, contracts with county bodies. When one closes, there are interests that don't want a close examination of what it was doing." "Crane." "Possibly. Or the people Crane represents." She tapped the pen against her desk. "Tell me about the marks." Brennan told her as specifically as he could without letting his voice change. He'd had enough practice keeping his voice flat by now. Hattie wrote something. "Are there other children from Harwick County? Do you know?" "Agnes thinks so. I don't have names." "I can find names," she wrote again. "This is what I can tell you, Mr. Holt. If this is only about the legality of your placement, it's a fight you might win and might lose depending on the judge. But if there's a pattern, documented harm to multiple children, systematic, then the legal ground shifts considerably. What do you need from me?" "Your testimony, Agnes Holloway's testimony, and I need access to Mira's physician." She paused. "She has been seen by a physician?" Brennan hesitated. "Not yet." Hattie gave him a look that lasted exactly 1 second. "That changes Monday," she said. The doctor in Thornfield was a woman named Evelyn Cross, which Brennan had not anticipated and which, given recent developments, he was beginning to think was simply how the competent professionals in this region were distributed. Dr. Cross examined Mira in a room with a window, and without making Mira remove anything until she had spent a considerable amount of time simply being in the room with her, asking nothing, arranging and rearranging things on her desk with the calm productivity of a woman who had time to wait. Brennan sat in the waiting room and turned his hat in his hands for an hour. When Dr. Cross came out, she asked him to come to her office. She was a measured woman, clinical in the useful sense. She understood that the clinical manner was sometimes the most merciful one, because it contained what it needed to contain and communicated precisely. "The marks on her back are consistent with deliberate and repeated application of a thin implement," she said. "A switch or similar. There are older marks and newer ones, which tells me this was ongoing rather than a single incident. There are also signs of former malnutrition. She's underweight for her age, and there are markers in her physical development that suggest extended periods of inadequate nutrition. A pause. There is bruising on the arches of her feet that is consistent with being struck on the soles. Brennan was quiet for a moment. How long? This didn't happen in a week, Dr. Cross said. Or a month. He nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when you've been told something you already knew but couldn't quite make yourself believe until someone with the authority to say it said it. I'll prepare a written medical assessment, Dr. Cross said. For your attorney, I assume. Yes. Good. She paused. Mr. Holt. He looked up. She has your dog's smell on her, Dr. Cross said. And grass. And whatever you use for soap. These are good signs. They're not the kind of signs we always see. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded again and went out to the waiting room, where Mira was sitting in the chair by the window with Soot, who he'd tied outside but who had apparently made his own arrangements, sitting pressed against the outside of the window glass, watching her through it with focused attention. She was looking at the dog. She was not looking at him, but she was looking at the dog, and the quality of her face in that moment, not quite softened, not yet, but less closed than he'd seen it, made him think of what Agnes had said 3 weeks ago, on the first day. She looked like you could stand some. And Mira had not answered, but she had come in. That was enough for now. He was learning that enough for now was how this worked. Not in big clear moments. In the small ones. A word about a bull calf. A dog at a window. A door left open. He went and got his horse, and he came back for her, and they rode north toward the ranch in the late afternoon light, and behind them the town went about its ordinary business. And ahead of them, though neither of them knew it yet, the fight was already forming. Papers filing, men talking, interests aligning against the inconvenient question of what had been done to the children no one had thought to protect. He'd paid $57 for a horse he didn't buy. It occurred to him on that ride that it might turn out to be the best money he'd ever spent. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Brennan was out mending the east fence line when Agnes came across the pasture with it, which told him something before he even read it. Agnes didn't walk out to the pasture for ordinary mail. She walked out for things that required an immediate human being to hand them to. He pulled off his work gloves and took it. The envelope was official, county seal pressed into the wax, the kind of envelope that had been designed to communicate authority before you opened it. He read it once, standing there in the grass with the September wind moving through, then read it again more slowly. Agnes waited. They're claiming the placement was improperly executed, he said. The County Welfare Committee. They say the auction method wasn't compliant with territorial statutes for child placement. He folded the letter. They want her back. Agnes was quiet for a moment, a meadowlark somewhere in the fence grass, the distant sound of cattle. Who signed it? She asked. He looked at the bottom of the letter. Committee chair, Fielding Crane. Agnes made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She turned and walked back toward the house, and Brennan stood there a little longer, looking at the letter, then at the fence line he'd been mending, then at the house where Mira was, he knew, because he'd checked that morning, sitting on the back step with Soot, holding a piece of bread she was tearing into pieces and feeding to him with the grave concentration of someone performing important work. He folded the letter into his coat pocket and went to find his horse. Oh, Hattie Gale read the letter at her desk without changing expression, which he was coming to understand was how she read everything. When she finished, she set it down and put both hands flat on the desk and said, "They moved faster than I expected." That bad? It means they're worried. She picked up the letter again and examined the signature. Crane doesn't move on anything without instruction. Someone told him to move. Who's above Crane? On paper, the full committee. In practice, she paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who'd been in small territorial politics long enough to know exactly which words were ammunition. There are 3 men in this county with enough money and influence to put Crane in motion on something like this. 2 of them I'm not certain about. 1 of them I am. Tell me. A man named Aldous Prentice. He owns the largest freight operation in the territory. which doesn't sound relevant until you understand that he held the supply contract for the Harwick facility for 11 years. Food, linens, coal. He was paid by the county for all of it, at rates that, when you look at what was actually delivered, don't quite add up. She looked at Brennan steadily. He's also one of the 3 largest donors to Crane's committee. Brennan was quiet. Outside the window, someone was arguing over a wagon blocking the road. So closing Harwick cost him the contract, Brennan said, among other things. And a thorough investigation of Harwick might raise questions about where 11 years of county supply money actually went. Hattie set the letter down again. He doesn't want Mira in a private home where someone is paying attention. He wants her in a controlled institution where the questions stay manageable. What do we do about the letter? We respond formally. I'll draft that today. We contest the procedural grounds, which are legitimate grounds to contest, and we file a counter-motion requesting the original placement be honored pending a full review. She picked up her pen. But that buys us time, not a resolution. The resolution requires evidence. Dr. Cross has prepared the medical report. I received it this morning. Hattie was quiet for a moment. It's strong. Deliberately inflicted injuries, pattern of malnutrition, developmental markers consistent with long-term neglect. The kind of document that, presented in front of the right judge, becomes very difficult to dismiss. She looked at him. I need other children. Names, current locations, testimony if possible. Mira can't stand as a single case. One child, no surname, no birth record, and a regular placement to a single man. They'll tear it apart. How do I find them? The Harwick facility records went somewhere when it closed. They don't disappear. They get transferred to the county clerk or to whoever assumed administrative oversight. I'm working on getting access. She wrote something. In the meantime, talk to people, ranchers, townsfolk, anyone who took in children from county placements in the last decade. The Harwick house ran for at least 15 years. Those children went somewhere. Brennan put his hat back on. How much time do we have? Hattie considered. The counter-motion will hold them for 4 to 6 weeks. After that, if we haven't made the case significantly stronger, a judge could order the return. She paused. Not every judge in this territory is in Prentice's back pocket, but enough of them are that we need to be careful about who we file in front of. He nodded and stood. Mr. Holt, Hattie said, without looking up from her writing, don't discuss the specifics with anyone you haven't already told. These things have a way of getting back. He didn't tell Mira. He wasn't sure how much she understood of adult conversations, and he wasn't sure how much she'd understood of her own situation in the first place, whether she knew she'd been on a platform, whether she knew what the alternatives had been. What he knew was that she was sleeping on the floor mattress still, but she'd moved it closer to the center of the room, away from the wall. He knew she'd started coming to the table without waiting to be called twice. He knew she'd said 4 more words since bull. Water? Said when her cup was empty. No, said clearly and without apology when Agnes suggested cutting her hair more evenly. There, said while pointing at a spot on the fence where a board had come loose. And once, soot, said in the dark of the kitchen when she couldn't find the dog, and Brennan had been the nearest person to ask. He knew that progress of this particular kind, slow, uneven, fragile, was the kind that could be undone. So he didn't tell her. He told Agnes because Agnes had a right to know, and because Agnes handled difficult information the way she handled everything, by absorbing it, sitting with it overnight, and coming back in the morning with a practical response. Agnes's practical response, this time, was to begin teaching Mira to wash dishes. Brennan came in to find them side by side at the kitchen basin, Agnes demonstrating the technique with the impersonal patience of a woman teaching a skill rather than managing a child, and Mira standing on a crate to reach the basin, concentrating on the cup in her hands with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided to engage with. She scrubbed the cup, rinsed it, held it up. Agnes looked at it. Good enough, she said. Not wonderful, not perfect. Good enough. Mira set it on the drying board. Brennan got himself coffee and went back outside. The first person he found was a woman named Ruth Mackey, who ran a small chicken farm 12 miles south of Iron Hollow with her husband and had, 7 years ago, taken in a boy named Emmett from a county placement. Brennan rode out to see her on a Wednesday, and she met him at the gate with the particular wariness of a woman who'd learned that people showing up unannounced were rarely bringing good news. He explained himself. She listened with her arms crossed, then uncrossed them slowly. "Emmett's 17 now," she said. "He helps with the farm." "Did he come from Harwick?" A pause. "The county didn't say Harwick specifically. They said a charitable house in the northern county. But the paperwork had a Harwick address." "How was he when you got him?" Ruth Mackey looked at the middle distance for a moment. She was a plain-spoken woman, and she gave him a plain-spoken answer. Thin, quiet in the wrong way. Didn't eat at table for 2 weeks. Kept taking food to his room and hiding it. A pause. "He had marks on his hands, on the backs of them, like burns." Brennan said carefully, "Would Emmett talk to a lawyer? Not in court, not yet, just to an attorney gathering information." She studied him. "Why?" He told her about Mira, about the medical report, about Fielding Crane's letter. He kept it factual and let the facts speak for themselves, which was the approach he'd found worked better with most people than any amount of persuasion. When he finished, Ruth Mackey was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I'll ask him. I won't force him. He's had enough of people deciding things for him." "That's all I'm asking," Brennan said. "Ask him." He found 3 more in the following 2 weeks. A girl named Clara, now 12, living with a farming family in Caldwell who had similar marks and similar food hoarding behaviors, and a mother who got quietly, steadily furious as Brennan described what he was finding. A boy named Thomas, 10, who had been placed with an elderly couple who had since passed, and who was now working at a livery stable in Sutter's Crossing, living in the loft, technically free, practically alone, and who looked at Brennan with the flat, evaluating eyes of a child who'd learned early that adults were an unpredictable weather system, and a woman named Sarah Dill, 22, who had been at Harwick as a young child and had aged out years ago and was now working as a seamstress in Thornfield, who came to Hattie's office on a Saturday morning and sat down and said without preamble, "I've been waiting for someone to ask." Sarah Dill was, of the people Brennan had found, the one Hattie spent the most time with. She had names, she had dates, she had a memory for specific details. The director's name, which was Harlan Voss, the system of punishment, which involved the soles of the feet and the back, and prolonged withholding of food, the supply deliveries that came less frequently than the records would have indicated, thin wasted sacks of flour and half-measured barrels of salted pork. The men who came to inspect the facility and left apparently satisfied, whom she could describe by appearance and, in 2 cases, by name. One of the names was Fielding Crane. Hattie wrote all of it down, and when Sarah Dill left, Hattie sat back in her chair and looked at her notes for a long moment. "This is enough to shift the case," she said. "Maybe enough to win it." "Maybe? The judge matters enormously." She looked at him. "I'm going to file in front of Judge Warren Alt in Thornfield. He's 61, former territorial marshal, doesn't owe anyone anything he hasn't already paid back, and he has grandchildren." She paused. "He also has a reputation for being impatient with what he calls the management of inconvenient facts." "What does that mean for us?" "It means if we present the evidence cleanly and he sees what I think he'll see, he won't allow it to be buried." A pause. "It also means if we have any gaps, any inconsistencies they can exploit, he won't paper over them for us. He expects the truth to be self-sufficient." Brennan thought about that. "Is it?" Hattie looked at her notes again. "The medical evidence is solid. The witness accounts corroborate each other on specific details they couldn't have coordinated. The supply contract discrepancies are documented in county records." She tapped her pen. "Yes, I think it is. The trouble came not from the legal proceedings, but from the town. Iron Hollow was small enough that most people had formed an opinion about the Holt situation within a week of his walking out of that square with the girl, and the opinions were distributed unevenly. Some people thought he'd done a decent thing. A larger number thought he'd done a foolish one. And a smaller but louder number had begun to say, in the way that loud minorities do in small towns, that there was something not quite right about a single man with no family taking in a girl child with no history. Brennan heard it for the first time at the feed store, where 2 men who stopped talking when he walked in had not stopped quite fast enough. He heard it again, differently phrased, from Peter Voss, who told him with the discomfort of a man delivering news he didn't enjoy delivering but considered a duty. "People are talking," Voss said. "I don't say I agree with it, but you should know." "What are they saying specifically?" Voss looked uncomfortable. "That a man alone taking a girl child, that it doesn't look right, that there might be reasons besides charity." Brennan was quiet for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw worked once and then stopped. "Agnes Holloway is in that house every day," he said finally. "I know that. Hattie Gale has been out to the ranch. Dr. Cross has been out to the ranch." He stopped. "Any of those women have raised a concern?" "No," Voss said. "No, none of them have." "Then the people talking," Brennan said, "are people who haven't been to the ranch. He paid for his supplies and left. And he did not say anything else about it, because he'd learned early that engaging the loudest version of a bad opinion usually amplified it. But that night, after Mira was in bed and Agnes was in her room, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a cold cup of coffee, and he felt, for the first time, something that was not exactly doubt, but was close enough to its neighbor to be uncomfortable. He thought about what he'd actually done. He thought about whether there was anything in his behavior, any single thing, that he'd need to be ashamed of if it were laid out in front of anyone. He went through it methodically, the way he went through accounts, line by line. He came up with nothing. That should have been reassuring. It was, partially. But he was also realistic enough to know that innocence and the appearance of innocence were two different things, and that in a small territory with a limited judicial pool, the second one mattered considerably. He went to Hattie the next day. She listened, and then she said something he hadn't expected. "This didn't start organically," she said. "This rumor." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "In my experience, rumors that gain traction this quickly in a small town need a push." She looked at her notes. "Someone with an interest in discrediting you specifically, rather than simply contesting the placement on procedural grounds. Someone who wants the judge to look at Brennan Holt and see something other than a man who intervened in good faith. Prentice, or Crane, on Prentice's instructions." She straightened her papers. "It's a tactic. Muddy the character of the opposing party. Make the case about him rather than the evidence." She looked at him directly. "The answer is to make the case very clearly about the evidence. Which we will." "When is the hearing?" 3 weeks. She paused. "I need you to do something difficult in those 3 weeks." "What?" "Nothing. Go home. Work your ranch. Be exactly what you are, visibly, without defending yourself or addressing the rumors. Let Agnes and Dr. Cross and every person who's been to that ranch speak for themselves if they choose to." She held his gaze. "Don't give anyone anything new to look at." He didn't like it. He was a man built for forward motion, for doing the next thing, for addressing problems directly when they were in front of him. Sitting still while people said things felt like an abdication of something, but he trusted Hattie's judgment more than his instinct, so he said, "All right," and he went home. 3 weeks was a long time to sit still. He filled it with the ranch, which always had more work than there was time for. He fixed the east fence completely, then the north gate, then the roof of the barn where 2 boards had gone soft over the winter. He and Agnes processed the last of the kitchen garden for storage. She directed, he carried, and he took the cattle to the south pasture and back again in a rotation he'd been meaning to do properly for 2 seasons. Mira watched all of it. That was her current mode, close observation, followed by participation when she decided to participate, which couldn't be predicted or scheduled. She watched him repair the barn roof from the yard below, sitting on a barrel with soot, for an hour before she came over and held the spare shingles without being asked, passing them up when he needed them, with the efficient timing of someone who had been watching carefully enough to understand the rhythm. He said thank you, each time and nothing else. One afternoon he looked down from the roof and she was gone, the barrel empty, soot still below. He finished the section he was on and came down and found her in the barn, in the stall where the calf she'd named Bull was kept, standing beside him with one hand flat on his flank. The calf stood very still, which was not his usual character. She didn't turn around when Brennan came to the stall doorway. "He's bigger than last week," she said. She said it like continuing a conversation, like they'd been talking about the calf's growth for months. Her voice was still rough and quiet, but there was something different in it now. Not the single-word utterance of the first weeks, but a full sentence delivered with the tone of someone who expected it to land. "He is," Brennan said. She kept her hand on the calf's flank. Bull turned his head and investigated her elbow, which she permitted. "Is someone going to take me away?" she said. He was very still in the doorway. He thought about what Hattie would say. He thought about what Agnes would say. He thought about what was technically true versus what was true in the way that mattered to a nearly 4-year-old child standing in a barn in Wyoming with her hand on a calf. "I'm fighting to make sure that doesn't happen," he said. She processed this. Fighting how? With a lawyer, in a courtroom. A pause. "Did you fight before?" He understood what she was asking. Had anyone fought before? For her, specifically. "I don't know," he said, which was honest. "I don't know what happened before you came here." She was quiet. The calf bumped his head against her arm. "I don't want to go," she said. Not to Brennan exactly. To the barn, or to the calf, or to nothing particular. Just said it out there. "I know," he said. He stayed in the doorway and didn't move. And after a while she came out past him and went back to the yard. And Soot got up and followed her, and Brennan stood in the smell of hay and cattle for a minute longer before he followed too. 2 days before the hearing, Hattie rode out to the ranch. She came in the afternoon and tied her horse and took Agnes's coffee without ceremony and spread papers on the kitchen table while Mira sat in the doorway to the yard, officially outside but clearly within earshot. Hattie kept her voice matter-of-fact and covered the structure of the next 2 days. The filing, the witnesses, the order of testimony, the documents they'd be presenting. She covered what Brennan should and shouldn't say if addressed directly. She covered the likely lines of attack from the committee's attorney, a man named Geo Stallings, who was competent and expensive and whose competence Hattie described with the professional respect of someone who took their opponent seriously. "He'll try to make this about your fitness," she said to Brennan. "Your circumstances, the unmarried status, the remote location, the age difference in your relationship with Agnes, which he'll try to frame as inadequate supervision. Agnes has been in this house for 15 years. I know, I'll be presenting that. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when it comes up." She looked at him steadily. "Don't react. Whatever he says, don't react. The moment you react, he has something to work with." Agnes, who had been standing at the stove with her back to them, said, without turning around, "What about the supply contract evidence?" "I'll be presenting it through county records," Hattie said. "Prentice's attorney will object to relevance. Judge Alt will either allow it or he won't. And if he doesn't, then we win on the child welfare evidence alone, which is still strong." Hattie paused. "But if he does allow it, the case against the committee's position becomes considerably more difficult for them to maintain with a straight face." She gathered her papers and stood up, and then she looked, for the first time that afternoon, toward the doorway where Mira was sitting. Mira was watching her, not in the hiding way, not the tucked chin and averted eyes. Watching directly, with the flat, measuring attention she'd given Brennan on the first day, which he now understood was not hostility, but assessment. She was figuring out what Hattie was. Hattie met the look without flinching or softening it. She said calmly, "I'm going to do my job." Mira looked at her for another moment. Then she looked back at the yard. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't trust. It was the particular response of a child who had learned to receive information and hold it carefully before deciding what to do with it. Hattie picked up her hat and went to her horse. Brennan followed her out. "Are we going to win this?" he asked when they were far enough from the house. Hattie put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. She looked down at him with the expression of a woman who chose precise answers over reassuring ones. "We have a real case," she said. "A real case in front of the right judge is the best position I know how to put you in." A pause. "The rest depends on things I can't control." She turned her horse and rode out, and Brennan stood in the yard and watched her go. And the wind moved through the grass, and behind him the ranch made its ordinary sounds. The cattle, the dog, the screen door swinging once in the kitchen. He turned back. There was work to finish before dark. The morning of the hearing, Brennan was up before 4. He didn't intend to be. He'd told himself the night before, with the reasonable conviction of a man who works physically demanding days, that he would sleep until 5:30, and that would be sufficient. But at 3:50, he was awake in the dark, with the specific, unhelpful alertness of a mind that had decided sleeping was finished regardless of what his body thought. And after 20 minutes of arguing with the ceiling, he got up, dressed quietly, and went to the kitchen. Agnes was already there. She had the fire going and a pot on, and she didn't say anything when he came in, which was one of the things about Agnes he had always valued. She understood that not every moment required commentary. He poured coffee and sat at the table, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when they've been through enough together, that silence is a form of conversation. After a while, Agnes said, "She was up in the night again." "Bad? Not as bad as the early weeks." "She went back to sleep." A pause. "She knows something is happening. She's not stupid." "No," Brennan said. "She's not." Agnes refilled her own cup. "Whatever happens today, she knows this house. She knows this ranch. She knows Soot, and she knows Bull, and she knows where the bread is kept." She said it the way she said most important things, matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing fence posts. "That doesn't disappear in a courtroom." Brennan looked at his coffee. "It could, though," he said. "Practically speaking." "Practically speaking," Agnes said. "A lot of things could happen that don't." She sat down. "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. They left Mira at the ranch with a neighboring family, the Aldersons, who had a girl of 5 and a boy of 7, and a mother who had been quietly supportive since the early weeks, and who had, on 2 occasions, brought food to the house without being asked and without making it a production. Mira had met the children twice and had established with them the same watchful, arm's-length engagement she gave to most things. Not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the middle distance. When Brennan told her they were going to town and that she would stay with the Aldersons for the day, she looked at him with her flat, measuring look. "Why can't I come?" "There's a meeting in a building. It's going to be long and not interesting, and I need to pay attention the whole time." "About me?" He hesitated 1 second too long. "About where you live, he said. She processed this. "And you're deciding?" "A judge is deciding. We're telling the judge what's true." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What if he doesn't believe you?" It was the right question. He didn't have a clean answer to it, so he gave her the true one. "Then we try again," he said. "We don't stop trying." She looked at him for a moment longer, then picked up the rabbit from the table. She still carried it, though less constantly now, and it had acquired a patch on the remaining ear from where Agnes had quietly repaired it, and went to get her coat. The territorial courthouse in Thornfield was a 2-story brick building on the main street that projected an authority slightly larger than the town deserved, which was, Brennan supposed, the point of courthouses everywhere. There were people on the steps when they arrived, more than he'd expected. Several he recognized as townspeople with no direct connection to the case. Small territory legal proceedings had an entertainment quality that Brennan found, in his current mood, profoundly irritating. Hattie was inside, already at the plaintiff's table, with 2 leather cases open and papers arranged in the systematic order of a person who had been here many times and knew exactly how much the first 10 minutes of a hearing could determine. Sitting at the opposing table was a broad man in a good suit who had the physical confidence of someone accustomed to rooms responding to his presence. Geo Stallings, Brennan assumed, confirmed, when Hattie glanced over and said quietly, "Don't look at him. Don't acknowledge him. You're not here for him." Agnes sat in the gallery, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, looking like a woman who had come to observe and form opinions, which was accurate. The witnesses Hattie had gathered were arranged in the first 2 rows, Ruth Mackey, composed and solid. Clara's mother, whose name was Vera Holt, no relation, and who had the compressed expression of a woman holding something in that would come out one way or another before the day was done. Thomas from the livery stable, 17 now in daylight, and closer to him, looking young and old simultaneously in the way that boys who've had hard childhoods often did. And Sarah Dill, in a good plain dress, sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. Fielding Crane sat behind Stallings with 2 other men from the committee. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, which suggested he understood the stakes. Aldous Prentice was not in the room. Brennan noticed this and mentioned it to Hattie in a low voice. He wouldn't come himself, she said, without looking up from her papers. He doesn't put himself in rooms where the proceedings might go sideways. He has people for that. Judge Warren Alt entered at 9 o'clock precisely, and the room stood, and he sat down, and he looked out at the gathered parties with the expression of a man who had seen every variety of human behavior a territorial bench could produce and was neither impressed nor discouraged by any of it. He was older than Brennan had pictured, somewhere past 60, with white hair cut close and eyes that moved around the room with the quick, cataloging attention of someone who read rooms for a living. He looked at Stallings' table, and then at Hattie's, and then briefly at Agnes in the gallery, and then he opened the proceedings. This is the matter of the County Welfare Committee versus the placement of the minor child identified as Mira in the household of Brennan Holt, he said. I've reviewed the pre-filed motions. We'll hear from the committee's position first, then the response. I expect factual testimony and documented evidence. I have limited tolerance for speculation dressed as argument. Counselors, proceed. Stallings went first, and he was good. Brennan had to give him that. He laid out the committee's position with the smooth confidence of someone who had constructed the argument carefully and knew which parts of it were solid. The placement had been executed outside established territorial procedure for child welfare. The county had an obligation to ensure the child's proper care, and that obligation superseded the preferences of any individual party. The Holt Ranch was an isolated location, operated by a single unmarried man with no relevant experience or family infrastructure to support a child of the minor's background. The county had identified a suitable institutional facility, the Caldwell home, with trained staff and an established record. He did not bring up the rumors directly. He was too careful for that. But he used language that gestured toward them, the kind of language that plants a seed without ever saying the seed's name, appropriate supervision, qualified oversight, the particular vulnerabilities of a child in the minor's circumstances, and let the room do the rest. Brennan kept his face still. He was aware of Agnes in the gallery and of Judge Alt on the bench, and he kept his eyes on the table in front of him and his hands flat on it and let Hattie's instructions sit on him like weight. Don't react. Whatever he says, don't react. When Stallings finished, Judge Alt said, "Response," and Hattie stood up. She was not Stallings' size or Stallings' style. She didn't project the same kind of easy authority. What she had instead was precision, the kind of precision that comes from knowing exactly which word to use and why, and being willing to use fewer words than the other side because she'd spent the extra time making sure the ones she used were the right ones. She began with the procedural question and dismantled it methodically, citing 3 specific territorial statutes that supported the legitimacy of the placement method. She called it what it was, a technicality being used as a lever. And then she moved on, and the move was deliberate, because what came next was not a technicality. She called Dr. Evelyn Cross. Dr. Cross took the stand with the composure of a professional inner element and presented the medical findings in the same precise, clinical language she'd used with Brennan in her office. The marks, their nature, their age, their distribution, the indicators of malnutrition and developmental delay. The pattern that was not consistent with ordinary childhood injury and was consistent with systematic and deliberate harm. She presented her written report and submitted it to the court. Stallings cross-examined. He challenged the methodology, the sample size, the degree of certainty, and the conclusions. Dr. Cross responded to each challenge with the patient firmness of someone who knew the difference between a legitimate scientific objection and a lawyer trying to muddy water, and she distinguished between them out loud in terms even a non-physician could follow. Judge Alt asked 2 questions of his own, which was not usual procedure and which told Brennan something about how the judge was tracking the testimony. Then Hattie called Sarah Dill. Sarah came to the stand and settled herself and looked at Judge Alt directly, not at the room, not at Stallings, not at Crane's table. She had decided who the relevant audience was, and she addressed herself to that person exclusively. She described the Harwick facility with the detailed, specific memory of someone who had been young enough when she arrived to have no defenses and old enough when she left to remember everything. She named Harlan Voss by name. She described the punishment system precisely, and her description matched on the specific details that couldn't be coincidental. The findings in Dr. Cross's medical report regarding Mira's injuries. She described the supply deliveries, the shortfalls, The men who came to inspect and inspected with eyes that looked at paperwork rather than children. And she named Fielding Crane. She said it without drama, without raising her voice. She said she had seen him twice, on 2 separate inspection visits, while she was at the facility. She said she had been directed by staff to be clean and quiet when visitors came. She described what he looked like then, and she identified him now from the stand, pointing with the flat certainty of a woman who did not confuse faces she had good reason to remember. The room shifted. It was not loud. Judge Alt's reputation for order was apparently sufficient to keep it from becoming loud, but Brennan felt it the way you feel weather change. The quality of attention in the room altered, the way it does when something is said that can't be unsaid. At Stallings' table, Crane had gone very still. Stallings stood for cross-examination, and his approach changed, less methodical, more reactive, which was the first sign that Sarah Dill's testimony had landed harder than he'd prepared for. He challenged her age at the time of the visits, the difficulty of identifying faces across years, the possibility of confusion. Sarah Dill looked at him with the expression of a woman who had anticipated this and was not particularly disturbed by it. "I was 8 years old," she said. "I was not confused. When you are a child in that place and a man comes to visit and you are told to be clean and quiet, you pay attention to that man's face. You want to know if he's going to help you." A pause. "He didn't." Stallings moved on quickly. Hattie then called Ruth Mackey, who testified about Emmett's condition on arrival. The hoarded food, the marks on his hands, the long adjustment, and then Clara's mother Vera, who did less well with composure than she'd probably intended, but whose raw, controlled fury under Stallings' cross-examination was its own kind of testimony, the kind that juries and judges registered in ways that clinical evidence couldn't entirely replicate. Thomas from the livery stable was last of the witnesses. He was the youngest and the least practiced at this, and it showed. He was quiet in a way that required the court reporter to ask him twice to repeat himself, and his hands moved in his lap during the testimony in the way that young men's hands do when they are trying to hold themselves together in public. But what he said was specific, and it was consistent, and it matched the pattern. When he stepped down, Hattie submitted the supply contract documentation. The county records showing Aldous Prentice's freight operation as the facility's supplier for 11 years, alongside the delivery logs that didn't match the billing records that didn't match the supply levels that could have supported the number of children in residence. Stallings objected to relevance. Judge Alt looked at the documents for a moment and said, "Overruled. It's relevant to the question of institutional oversight and who had interest in maintaining the facility's operation without scrutiny." "Continue." At the word overruled, something small shifted in Brennan's chest. He didn't let it show. The afternoon broke at 1 o'clock for an hour's recess. Brennan went outside and stood on the courthouse steps in the September air and tried to eat the sandwich Agnes had packed that morning and mostly failed at it. Hattie came out after 10 minutes and stood beside him. "How is it?" he asked. "Better than I expected," she said. "Alt is not giving them the procedural angle. He's treating this as a child welfare question, which is the correct framing and the one least favorable to Stallings' position." She looked at the street. But Stallings is going to make his closing argument about institutional capacity. He's going to say that however imperfect the oversight was at Harwick, the answer is better institutions with better oversight, not ad hoc private placements with unvetted individuals. She paused. "It's not a stupid argument. It's the kind of argument that sounds reasonable if you're not looking too closely at the specific individual. And if you are looking closely, then the record of what Agnes Holloway has observed, what Dr. Cross has documented about Mira's physical improvement in the 4 months since placement, and what every person who has been to your ranch has said about the environment, that's the counter." She looked at him. "I'm going to call you this afternoon." He hadn't expected that. "You said—" "I know what I said. I'm changing the plan." She was quiet for a moment. "Stallings is going to make this about what kind of man you are. The only person who can answer that directly is you. Everything else is testimony about you. I need testimony from you." He thought about what she'd said 2 days ago. Don't give anyone anything new to look at. "What do I say?" "The truth," Hattie said. "Exactly and only the truth. Don't embellish. Don't justify. Don't explain yourself past what you're asked. She looked at him levelly. You made a decision on a Tuesday morning in Iron Hollow, and you've acted from it consistently for 4 months. That's what you say. He was on the stand for 40 minutes. Hattie took him through it in order. The morning in the square, the decision, the signing, the ride home. The first night. Agnes's observation about the marks. His decision to find Dr. Cross and then Hattie. His search for the other children. The state of the ranch, the daily routine. The specifics of what Mira's daily life looked like now versus 4 months ago. He answered each question the way Hattie had told him to. Directly, without decoration, without the kind of emotional scaffolding that could be read as performance. He was, at base, a man describing things he had done and things he had observed, and he tried to stay exactly in those lanes. Then Stallings cross-examined. He came at it from 3 angles. First, the practical, the remote location, the lack of family, the absence of formal training in child welfare or trauma care. Brennan acknowledged each fact without arguing with it. Yes, the ranch was 12 miles from town. Yes, he was unmarried. Yes, he had no formal training. He did not say, but after any of these things. He let them sit as facts. Then the character angle, the thing Brennan had been waiting for. Stallings phrased it carefully, technically as a question. Mr. Holt, would you say there's anything unusual about a single man in his mid-30s making an immediate, impulsive decision to take sole custody of a female child with no family oversight? Brennan looked at him. I'd say it was unusual, he said. Most people walked past her. A beat. Stallings moved on quickly to the third angle, which was motive. What did Brennan Holt actually gain from this arrangement? Free labor? Tax relief? The sympathy of the community? He didn't ask any of these things directly, because direct wasn't his method, but he circled the question with enough implication that the implication was clear. Brennan answered the actual question asked each time and declined, internally, to answer the questions not asked. When he stepped down, his hands were steady, which surprised him slightly. He sat down next to Hattie, and she didn't say anything, which he interpreted as an assessment rather than a silence. Stallings' closing argument was, as Hattie had predicted, institutional. The territory had an obligation. Harwick had failed, and that failure was being addressed. But the answer was reform, better oversight, properly staffed facilities, not the dismantling of a placement system in favor of unvetted private arrangements motivated by sentiment. He was measured and he was professional, and he made the argument as well as the argument could be made. Then Hattie stood up. Her closing was shorter than Stallings by half. She stood at the front of the room, and she spoke without notes. The committee has argued for institutional capacity, she said. The evidence you have heard today is a record of what institutional capacity, in this specific case, produced for the children in its care. Deliberate injury, systematic malnutrition, verified by medical evidence, corroborated by multiple witnesses across multiple years, documented in financial records that suggest the failure was not accidental, but was known and maintained by people with financial interest in its continuation. She paused. Against that record, the committee asked this court to question the fitness of a man who rode into Iron Hollow one Tuesday morning and saw a 3-year-old child on an auction platform and made a decision. That man then found a physician, an attorney, and 5 witnesses who corroborate the nature of that child's prior treatment. He did not hide what he found. He brought it into this courtroom. She looked at Judge Alt directly. The question before this court is not whether Brennan Holt is a perfect guardian. The question is whether returning this child to the system that harmed her, or to any affiliate of that system, serves her welfare. The evidence answers that question. I asked the court to answer it accordingly. She sat down. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something has been said that settles. Judge Alt looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked at Brennan once, briefly, with eyes that gave nothing away. I'll have a ruling by Friday morning, he said. Court is in recess. He stood, and the room stood, and he walked out. And for a moment, everyone in that courthouse stayed exactly where they were, as if moving too quickly would disturb something that was still being decided in the air. Then people began to move, and Brennan became aware of Agnes behind him, and Hattie beside him. And the sound of the gallery dispersing, and the smell of the room, wood and wool, and the particular closed-air quality of official buildings. And he thought about Mira at the Alderson farm, probably watching their chickens with the close attention she gave to animals, holding the rabbit, waiting. He thought about what he'd said to her that morning. We don't stop trying. He'd meant it then. He still meant it. He was also honest enough with himself to acknowledge that meaning it and having it be enough were two different propositions, and that Friday morning was 3 days away, and that he had no real sense of which way this was going to fall. Hattie was putting papers in her case. "What do you think?" Brennan asked. She didn't answer immediately. She aligned 2 folders and closed the case and looked at him. "I think we gave him what I said we needed to give him," she said. "A case that's self-sufficient." A pause. "I think it was enough. But I've been wrong before, and Alt is his own man, and the only thing I know for certain is that it's out of our hands now." She picked up her case. "Go home," she said. "Do what you do on any other day. That's all there is." He drove back to the ranch in the early evening, Agnes beside him on the wagon bench, neither of them talking much. The land on either side of the road was the same land it always was. The grass gone golden at this point in September, the hills low and long, the sky wide and beginning its evening shift toward orange. He picked up Mira from the Aldersons, and she came out to the wagon and climbed up without being lifted. She was doing that more now, managing her own small heights, and she sat between him and Agnes and looked at the road ahead. "How was your day?" Brennan asked. "Their chickens are afraid of me," she said. She sounded mildly dissatisfied about this. "Chickens are afraid of everything new," Agnes said. "Soot isn't afraid of anything new." "Soot is an exception," Agnes said. "Don't use Soot as your measure." Mira considered this. The wagon rolled on, and Soot, who had, somehow, arranged to be at the Aldersons when they arrived, having apparently covered 12 miles in the time they were in court, sat in the wagon bed behind them with the satisfied air of a dog who had managed his day correctly. They ate supper when they got home, and Agnes washed up, and Mira put herself to bed without being asked, which was a new development of the last 2 weeks and which Brennan took as evidence of something, though he wasn't sure what. He sat on the porch after, in the dark, listening to the ranch settle into its night sounds. He thought about Judge Alt's face, unreadable, efficient, the face of a man who'd heard everything and was keeping his conclusion private until Friday. He thought about Sarah Dill on the stand, pointing across the room at Fielding Crane with the flat certainty of a woman done being quiet. He thought about Mira in the barn, her hand on the calf's flank, asking, "Is someone going to take me away?" He'd told her, "I'm fighting to make sure that doesn't happen." He was done fighting, now for the moment. He'd given it everything he had, and so had Hattie, and so had the witnesses who'd shown up and told the truth in a room full of strangers at some cost to themselves. And now the fight was in the hands of a 61-year-old former marshal with white hair and quick eyes, and there was nothing left to do but wait. He was not good at waiting. He'd never been good at it. But he was learning. Friday came the way difficult days tend to. Ordinary on its surface, the same pale morning light through the same kitchen window, the same sounds from the barn, the same smell of coffee and wood smoke. Brennan was up at 5. He did the morning chores because the cattle didn't care about court rulings and the fence still needed checking, and the physical work of the ranch was, he had come to understand over 3 days of waiting, the only thing that kept him from sitting at the kitchen table and thinking himself in circles. He fed the stock and checked the water and walked the north fence line and came back with mud on his boots and a better grip on himself than he'd had when he left. Agnes had breakfast on the table. Mira was already up. She'd been waking earlier lately, another recent shift, and she was sitting across from Agnes's chair with a cup of warm milk and the rabbit on the table beside her, which she no longer carried everywhere but which appeared at the table sometimes, positioned with a specificity that suggested it was attending rather than being stored. "You're going to town," Mira said. "Not a question." "Judge has his ruling today," Brennan said. She looked at the rabbit. "Can I come this time?" He'd thought about this. He'd thought about it the way he thought about most things involving Mira, carefully, from multiple angles, aware that his instinct and the right answer were not always the same thing. "Yes," he said. Agnes looked at him briefly over her coffee cup. He met the look. She went back to her coffee. "You'll need to be very quiet," he said to Mira. "In the room. Whatever happens, quiet. Can you do that?" She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to questions she intended to answer honestly. "I can be quiet," she said. "I'm good at quiet." That was true. He'd never known anyone better at it. Masab. They arrived in Thornfield an hour before the ruling, which gave Brennan time to find Hattie in the small room adjacent to the courtroom that she'd been using to organize her papers. She looked up when he came in and then looked at Mira beside him, and something moved across her expression. Not surprise exactly, more recalibration. "I brought her," he said. She asked. Hattie looked at Mira directly. "You understand what happens in there today?" Mira looked back at her. "Someone decides where I live." "That's right. Are you going to win?" Hattie was quiet for a moment, and Brennan appreciated that she didn't give the child a comfortable answer she couldn't guarantee. "I did everything I know how to do," Hattie said. "The rest is the judge." Mira absorbed this. She looked around the small room, the papers, the leather cases, the particular organized density of Hattie's workspace. And then she sat down in the chair by the wall without being invited to, and put the rabbit in her lap and was, as she had promised, quiet. Hattie looked at Brennan. He lifted his shoulders slightly. Hattie went back to her papers. The courtroom was less crowded than it had been on Tuesday. The entertainment seekers had largely satisfied their interest. What remained was a smaller, more specific group, people with a direct stake or a genuine concern. Ruth Mackey was in the gallery. So was Vera, Claire's mother. Sarah Dill was there, in the same plain dress, in the same seat, with the same forward-facing attention. Agnes came in and sat beside her without introduction, and they did not speak, but the small acknowledgement between them, the slight nod, had the quality of recognition between women who had done similar things for different reasons. Stallings was at his table with a younger associate Brennan hadn't seen before. Crane was behind them, with only one committee member now instead of two. The empty chair where the second had sat on Tuesday struck Brennan as possibly significant, though he didn't know enough about committee politics to be sure. Mira sat beside Brennan at the plaintiff's table. Hattie had not objected to this, and Stallings, after one glance at the child, had apparently decided that objecting to a 4-year-old sitting beside her guardian in a proceeding about her own welfare was not a posture he wanted to take in front of this particular judge. Judge Alt came in at 9 o'clock exactly, and the room stood, and he sat, and he looked out at the assembled parties with the same cataloging efficiency as before, and then he looked down at the papers in front of him. The room was very quiet. Brennan was aware of Mira beside him, not fidgeting, not looking around, sitting with both feet flat on the floor, and the rabbit on the table in front of her and her eyes on the judge. He had the sudden clear thought that she had spent most of her short life in rooms where decisions were made about her without her, and that whatever she felt about being here today, she had chosen to be present for this one. Judge Alt cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the testimony, the documentary evidence, and the motions submitted by both parties," he said. "I'll give my reasoning briefly before the ruling because I think the record of this case warrants it." He looked at the papers, then up. "The committee's procedural argument regarding the placement method has some technical merit," he said. "The auction placement is an irregular mechanism and one I'd recommend the territory revisit legislatively. However, procedural irregularity in and of itself does not determine the welfare outcome for a specific child, and the welfare outcome for this specific child is the central question before this court." Stallings was still. Crane had his hands folded on the table in front of him. "The evidence presented regarding the Harwick County Charity House," Judge Alt continued, "is credible, internally consistent, and medically documented. The pattern of injuries described by Dr. Cross and corroborated by multiple witnesses is not consistent with accidental harm or with reasonable disciplinary practice. It is consistent with systematic abuse over an extended period." A pause. "The financial documentation raises additional questions regarding the oversight of that facility that are outside the scope of this proceeding, but which I am referring to the Territorial Attorney's Office for investigation." At Stallings' table, the younger associate wrote something quickly. "Regarding the fitness of the current placement," Judge Alt said, "I have testimony from a licensed physician, an experienced housekeeper of 15 years standing, and multiple community members, all of whom have direct observation of the child's condition and circumstances in the Holt household. That testimony describes measurable physical and developmental improvement over a 4-month period. It describes a stable, consistent environment." He paused. "It also describes an imperfect one. run by a man with no formal training and real limitations, which is an accurate description of most functioning households in this territory. Something small moved at the corner of Hattie's mouth. On the question of the character of Brennan Holt, the judge said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but more deliberate. I found his testimony credible, and his account consistent with the documentary record. I note that he made no attempt to obscure the conditions he found, sought professional guidance immediately, and cooperated fully with the court process. These are not the actions of a man with something to hide. Another pause. They are, in point of fact, the actions of a man who understood what he'd taken on and made a reasonable attempt to do right by it. Brennan was looking at the table. He made himself look up. It is the ruling of this court, Judge Olt said, that the placement of the minor child identified as Mira in the household of Brennan Holt is legally affirmed. Full guardianship is granted to Brennan Holt, with the condition of quarterly review for the first 2 years to be conducted by an independent county welfare officer, not a member of the current committee, whose reports will be submitted to this court. He looked up from the papers. The committee's motion to return the child to institutional placement is denied. He set the papers down. The referral to the territorial attorney's office will proceed immediately. Court is adjourned. He stood. The room stood. He walked out. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Agnes, in the gallery, made a sound that was not quite a word. Ruth Mackey put her hand over her mouth. Vera covered her face entirely for a moment, then took her hands away and straightened her back. Brennan became aware that Mira, beside him, had put her hand on his forearm. It was the first time she had reached for him, voluntarily, with intention. A small hand flat on his sleeve, fingers not gripping. He looked at her. She was looking at the bench where the judge had been, processing something. "We're staying?" she said. "We're staying," he said. She took her hand back, picked up the rabbit, and held it in her lap. She didn't cry. He didn't either, though the thing in his chest that had been compressed and waiting for 3 days released in a way he felt physically, like a joint unlocking. Hattie was already on her feet, organizing papers with the efficient speed of a woman who had allowed herself about 4 seconds of satisfaction and was now moving on to the next set of problems. "The Attorney General referral is significant," she said when Brennan came to stand beside her. "Prentice is going to know about it within the hour. Is that bad for us?" "Not for you, for him." She looked up. "He's going to be very busy in the coming weeks, and that tends to make men like that less interested in picking secondary fights." A pause. "I'd expect Crane to go very quiet. I'd also expect you won't hear from the committee again." He thought about Fielding Crane, sitting at that table with his carefully folded hands and his county badge and his soft face. He thought about what Sarah Dill had said on the stand. "You want to know if he's going to help you." He didn't. "Will they actually investigate Prentice?" he asked. "Or does it disappear into paperwork?" Hattie was honest. "I don't know. Territorial attorney referrals have a variable history. It depends on who picks it up and what pressure they're under." She looked at him steadily. "But the record is now public. The financial discrepancies are in the court record. That doesn't disappear regardless of what the attorney's office does." It wasn't the answer he wanted. It was the true one, which he'd learned to value more. Sarah Dill found him on the courthouse steps afterward. She was putting on her coat and she stopped when she saw him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the way that people look at each other when they've been through something together without having planned to. "Thank you," Brennan said, "for what you did in there." She shook her head slightly. "I did it for me as much as for you, or for the kids still in places like that." A pause. "Did they say anything about the investigation? Whether they'll actually look at the other facilities?" "Not specifically. Hattie thinks the referral has teeth. She's not certain." Sarah Dill looked at the street. "There are other places like Harwick," she said. "Different names, same arrangements. The Prentice supply contract wasn't exclusive to one facility." She looked at him. "I've been collecting names for 2 years. I didn't know what to do with them." "Tell Hattie," Brennan said. "She'll know what to do with them." Sarah considered this and nodded once. She buttoned her coat and walked down the steps, and he watched her go. A young woman walking with the particular purpose of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just found somewhere to set part of it down. The drive home was quieter than the drive-in had been, which was its own kind of relief. the silence of something resolved rather than something pending. Agnes sat straight as always on the wagon bench, but the set of her shoulders was different, fractionally looser, the posture of a woman who had held herself at readiness for weeks and was allowing herself to ease. Mira sat between them and watched the road and eventually fell asleep against Agnes's arm, which Agnes permitted without comment, sitting very still so as not to disturb her. Brennan watched the road and drove. About 4 miles out from the ranch, Agnes said quietly, "She's going to need a surname." He hadn't thought about it. Or he had, in the abstract, but not in the practical way. The specific question of what the court documents would eventually say. "I know," he said. "You're her guardian now, legally." "I know, Agnes." A pause. "I'm not suggesting anything," Agnes said, in the tone of a person who is absolutely suggesting something. He was quiet for a mile or so. The afternoon had gone warm in the way September afternoons sometimes do in Wyoming, the sun generous in a way that wouldn't last. The grass on either side of the road was the deep gold of the season. "She'd have to agree to it," he said. "Obviously," Agnes said. "She's 4. She understands more than 4 usually means." Agnes looked ahead. "You don't have to decide today." He didn't decide today, but he thought about it the rest of the drive, the way you think about something that has quietly already become true and is just waiting for the words to catch up with it. The weeks after the ruling were not transformed. That was the first thing he learned, or relearned, maybe, since he'd been learning versions of this since August. Things did not become easy. They became different. The quarterly welfare reviews began in November, conducted by a woman named Officer Clary Sutton, who had gray hair and sharp eyes and approached the review process with the focused pragmatism of someone who understood both the value and the limitation of official visits. She came to the ranch, walked through it, talked to Agnes, observed Mira for 2 hours, and wrote in her report, which Hattie received a copy of, that the child appeared well-nourished, physically developing within normal range for her age, and engaged with her environment in ways consistent with improved security of attachment. Brennan read the phrase 3 times. He wasn't sure he could have defined it technically, but he knew exactly what it described. He'd been watching it happen in small increments for 4 months. Mira still slept on the floor. She had moved the mattress back to the cot frame in October, a change she made herself one morning, apparently on a decision she didn't announce. But the mattress was on the floor beside the cot, and she slept on that, and the cot itself held her blankets and the rabbit during the day. He didn't comment on this arrangement. Officer Sutton didn't either, which he appreciated. She still hoarded food sometimes, though the urgency had diminished. Agnes found bread in the pocket of her coat in November and said nothing, just quietly replaced it with a fresh piece. Brennan found 3 dried biscuits under the edge of her mattress in December, and he left them there. She still flinched at sudden movement. She still went very still and very quiet when voices rose, even in warmth. Laughter, sometimes, startled her in the same way that anger had, and he'd had to learn that the sudden sound of a good thing could carry the same physical signature as the sudden sound of a bad one, in a body that had spent its early years making no distinction between them. But she had started asking questions, not the cautious single-word questions of the early weeks, but real ones, questions that assumed she was owed an answer, questions that revealed she had been observing the world around her with the careful attention of someone building a private theory of how things worked. She wanted to know why the creek ran lower in summer. She wanted to know why cattle had different temperaments. She wanted to know why Agnes's biscuits tasted different from the ones at the Aldersons. Not better or worse, she specified, different. And when Agnes explained the variation in fat ratios, Mira listened with the focused absorption of a child filing information she intended to use. She started talking to Bull directly. Brennan would find her at the fence with her arms on the top rail, delivering a monologue in a quiet, even voice about whatever was on her mind. The weather, the condition of the pasture, something Agnes had said at breakfast. Bull would stand near her with the placid attention of an animal that has been assigned a role and accepted it. Whether he understood anything was beside the point. She wasn't talking to him for comprehension. She was talking because talking had stopped being dangerous. One evening in November, she came to the kitchen table while Brennan was going over the ranch accounts and sat across from him, which she didn't usually do. She tended to inhabit the edges of rooms rather than the centers. And she watched him work for a few minutes. "What are you doing?" she asked. Figuring out where the money is and where it needs to go. Is there enough? He looked up. It was a specific question, an adult question, the kind of question someone asks when they've had experience of there not being enough. This year, yes, he said honestly. Some years are tighter than others. We manage. She considered this. What happens if there isn't enough? Then we figure out what's necessary and what isn't, and we do without the second kind. He looked at her. It hasn't put us on the road yet. She thought about the road clearly. Where would we go? If it did? It won't, he said. But if it did, we'd figure that out too. He held her gaze. There's always a next step. You just have to find it. She looked at the account book for a moment, then back at him. Can you teach me to do that? He blinked. The accounts? The figuring out, the where the money is and where it needs to go. He thought about it. She was 4, nearly 5 now by Agnes's estimate. The county had placed her birthday in winter. Approximate. The kind of approximate that came from an intake form filled out by someone guessing. When you're a little older, he said, I'll teach you. She accepted this without argument, which was her mode with things she intended to hold him to. No debate, just filing. Christmas came, which neither Brennan nor Agnes had particularly celebrated in the years before. The ranch being what it was, and their relationship being more functional than ceremonious. Agnes made a point of it this year, matter-of-factly and without excessive sentiment. A tree cut from the East Grove, a few simple decorations she produced from a box Brennan hadn't known existed, a meal that took considerably more effort than any other Thursday in recent memory. Mira watched all of it with the focused attention she gave to new things, filing each element into her private system. On the morning itself, there were 2 wrapped packages on the table for her. One from Agnes, which was a pair of properly fitted boots, a fact so practical it was its own kind of tenderness, and one from Brennan, which was a book. Not a children's picture book. Those had not seemed right to him. She already used language with too much precision for them. But a simple natural history book with detailed illustrations of animals and their habits, which he'd found at the bookseller in Thornfield and held in his hands for a while before deciding. She opened Agnes's package first, turned the boots over, looked at the soles. They fit? She asked. Measured your old ones, Agnes said. She put them on immediately. She opened Brennan's package more slowly, unfolding the paper with care rather than tearing it. She looked at the cover, then opened it to a page in the middle, a detailed illustration of a barn owl, and studied it for a long time. There's one, she said. In the East Barn. I've heard it. I know, he said. I thought you'd want to know more about it. She looked at the illustration a little longer. Then she closed the book carefully and held it in both hands and looked at him across the table. Thank you, she said. Not the performed thank you of a child who has been instructed to say the words, just the actual one, delivered with the directness she brought to everything she meant. You're welcome, he said. Agnes at the stove stirred something and said nothing, which was how she handled moments that called for nothing except letting them be. Spring arrived, and with it the thaw and the mud and the particular chaos of a ranch coming back to life after winter. Mira turned 5 in the estimated February window, which Agnes had marked with a cake she declined to call a birthday cake. She called it a cake for Tuesday, which happened to be Tuesday, and Mira had eaten 2 pieces and fed a 3rd piece to Soot under the table in a way both adults could clearly see and both adults chose not to see. The territorial attorney's investigation into Aldous Prentice had been moving through the slow machinery of legal process, surfacing occasionally in a Thornfield newspaper story that Hattie forwarded to Brennan with brief annotations in the margins. The supply contract discrepancies had been confirmed. 2 of Prentice's associates had been named in formal proceedings. Prentice himself was, as of the last letter from Hattie in March, under significant scrutiny, though she remained measured about predicting outcomes. Fielding Crane had resigned from the County Welfare Committee in January. The official reason was health. Nobody publicly disputed this. Sarah Dill had met with Hattie 3 times and had provided names and documentation regarding 2 other facilities with similar supply arrangements and similar patterns of complaints that had never been formally investigated. Hattie was working with a territorial advocacy group that Brennan had not previously heard of, building something that was larger than a single case. He thought about this sometimes. The way one Tuesday morning in August had connected to all of this, the thread running from his split-second decision in that square to Hattie's expanding dossier of names and facilities and supply contracts. He didn't think about it with any sense of his own importance in it. He thought about it more the way you think about how water moves. Starting at one point, finding the next low place, running where it can run, not planning the course but covering it. One afternoon in April, Mira came to find him where he was working in the south pasture. She had walked the half-mile from the house on her own, something she'd started doing in March without asking permission and without being stopped, establishing the independence with the quiet confidence of someone who had decided that the world was navigable and intended to navigate it. She still told Agnes where she was going. She always came back. She found him at the fence and stood on the bottom rail, which she still liked, and said without preamble, "Agnes says you should come in for supper soon." "I've got another hour of work," he said. "She said you'd say that. She said to tell you the fence has been there for 20 years and supper is now." He looked at the fence and then at Mira. "She's not wrong about either of those things," he said. Mira jumped down from the rail. She was taller than she'd been in August. Obvious, of course, children grew. But it was still sometimes an adjustment. And she was wearing the boots Agnes had given her at Christmas and the coat he'd bought her in February, and she stood in the spring grass with the particular ease of a child who belongs to a place, who has settled into it the way a root settles into soil, quietly and without announcement. He put down his tools and walked back with her. They didn't talk much on the walk. She asked him one thing. "Is the calf bigger than the other cattle yet?" And he said, "Not yet, probably another year," and she thought about this with the patient long view that she applied to things she was interested in, storing the information for the relevant future. At the gate to the yard, she stopped and looked up at him. "I want your name," she said. He stopped too. She met his eyes with the directness she brought to everything she had decided. Hattie said I can have it, legally. Agnes said I should ask you. She paused. "So I'm asking." He looked at her. This child, who had been on a platform in August with no name and no shoes and a rabbit with one ear, who had wedged herself into a corner and keened in the dark and flinched at every raised voice and hidden bread in her coat, and learned incrementally, painstakingly, and without any particular grace on either of their parts, that the world contained rooms where the door was left open. "Yes," he said, "you can have it." She nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded when things she'd already decided were confirmed by the relevant parties. "Mira Holt," she said, trying it out, the sound of it. "Mira Holt," he agreed. She turned and went through the gate to the yard, where Soot was waiting with the faithful patience of a dog who has appointed himself to someone and intends to fulfill the appointment, and supper was on the table inside, and Agnes was at the stove with her back to the door, and her particular brand of "I am not being sentimental" about anything posture firmly in place, and the ranch was doing its evening sounds around all of them, the cattle, the creek, the wind in the new grass. Brennan stood at the gate for a moment. He'd gone to buy a horse in August. He hadn't gotten the horse. He closed the gate and went in. The years did what years do. They accumulated without announcing themselves, each one looking more or less like the one before until you turned around and the distance was surprising. Mira Holt grew up, not easily, not without difficulty, not in the clean narrative arc that people sometimes construct in retrospect when they want a hard story to have a satisfying shape. She grew up the way most people do, unevenly, with setbacks that didn't announce their lessons until long after the fact, with progress that was only visible when you compared the current version to a previous one and allowed yourself a moment of honest accounting. She was a serious child and she became a serious young woman. The seriousness wasn't heaviness. It was more like density, a quality of being present and attentive in a way that people noticed without always being able to name. She had opinions. She expressed them with the directness she had always brought to everything she decided to say, which occasionally startled people who expected something softer from a young woman in the Wyoming territory of the 1890s, and which she had long since stopped apologizing for. She had nightmares for years. This was not something she hid from Brennan and Agnes, but it was not something she discussed either. It was simply a known condition of the household, the way the north pasture flooded in April and the east barn caught wind from the wrong direction. You managed around it. She learned over time to manage herself around it, to recognize the particular quality of sleep that was heading somewhere bad, and to surface from it before it got there, to sit up in the dark with the lamp lit and the rabbit, worn now to a state of essential thread and intent, and read until her mind found its way back to the present. She read everything. Brennan had started her on the natural history book at 5, and by 8 she had exhausted what the bookseller in Thornfield could supply and was sending for catalogs from publishers in Denver and occasionally Chicago. Agnes, who had never been given to book reading herself, regarded this development with the practical approval of someone who understood that a mind needed feeding the same way a body did, and she periodically found Mira's books and moved them to more organized positions on the shelves she'd asked Brennan to build in the small room that had become Mira's room, where the mattress was now on the actual bed frame and had been for years. Brennan taught her the accounts, as he had promised. He started when she was 7, which she'd decided was old enough when she arrived at the kitchen table one evening with a piece of paper and a pencil and said, without preamble, "I'm ready." He taught her the basics of ranch finance, income, expense, the particular math of livestock operations, the relationship between grass quality and cattle weight and market price. She was quick and she was accurate, and she asked questions that occasionally required him to think carefully before answering, which he considered a mark of good questions. Agnes taught her to cook with the same impersonal efficiency she brought to everything, making no distinction between practical skills a girl needed and practical skills a person needed, which meant Mira learned to make biscuits and also to sharpen tools, to preserve vegetables and also to read a weather sky, to mend fabric and also to run a fence line. Agnes was not a woman who had ever found the category of women's work particularly useful, and she did not install it in Mira. Soot died in the winter of Mira's 8th year. He was old for a cattle dog, and he went quietly, which was consistent with his character in that he had always been a dog who did things with purpose and without drama. Mira buried him at the edge of the east pasture, in a spot she selected herself, and she stood at the grave for a long time alone before she came back to the house. She didn't cry in front of anyone. Brennan suspected she cried at the grave, or in her room, or somewhere private. She had learned early that grief was something to be kept and tended in one's own space, which was not always a healthy lesson, but was one that had been installed in her too early and too deeply to be easily revised. 2 days later, she told Brennan she wanted another dog. Not to replace him, she said, with the precision she brought to distinctions that mattered to her. Just another dog. All right, he said. The next dog was named Flint, and he was nothing like Soot in temperament or color or disposition, which may have been why the arrangement worked. Bull the bull calf grew into Bull the bull, which created certain management challenges that Mira found philosophically interesting. She had named him from a position of observation, and he had grown into something that required considerable practical management, and she reflected aloud once, when she was about 12, that this was probably a useful lesson in the relationship between naming things and being responsible for them. Brennan, listening from the other side of the fence, said that was a fairly sophisticated observation for someone who had named the animal at 3. "I was working with limited information at 3, she said. "Fair point," he said. The investigation into Aldous Prentice ran for 3 years. It expanded, as Hattie had expected it might, when Sarah Dill's documentation of the other facilities was incorporated into the territorial attorney's inquiry. By the time it concluded, in 1891, the results were mixed in the way that legal outcomes in small territories with complicated political economies tended to be mixed. 2 of Prentice's associates were formally charged and 1 was convicted. The supply contracts were canceled across all affected facilities, and Prentice himself paid a significant financial settlement and was formally censured by the Territorial Business Council, which was not imprisonment but was public and documented and followed him. Hattie wrote to Brennan about the final outcome with her usual measured tone, noting the gaps in what had been achieved alongside the parts that held. She said, "It is not complete justice. There is rarely complete justice in these cases. What it is a record that cannot be expunged, and a process that established precedents for how similar facilities are overseen going forward. That is not nothing." Brennan read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Agnes, who read it and set it down and said, "She's right. It's not nothing." He put the letter in the file he kept of the case's history. Mira read it eventually when she was old enough, and she read it with the focused attention she gave to things that were part of her story, whether she had chosen them or not. No. She was 16 when she told Brennan she wanted to study education. She said it at supper, in the direct way she had of raising subjects she'd been thinking about privately for some time before they came to the table. She never floated ideas. She presented decisions. "There's a normal school in Cheyenne," she said. 2-year program. Teacher certification for the territory. Brennan looked at her across the table. Agnes kept eating, which was how Agnes signaled that she already knew about this and had formed an opinion and was leaving the conversation where it belonged. "You've looked into it," he said, "for about 6 months. And you've decided. I'm telling you," she said, "I thought you should know before I wrote to apply." He was quiet for a moment. Cheyenne was far. 2 years was a long time. He was 50 now, and the ranch was still the ranch. And Agnes was 79 and still in the house, but slower in the mornings than she had been. And the thought of Mira at distance produced a feeling he didn't try to dress up as something practical. "Why education?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "You know why." He did know why. He had watched it develop over years. The way she positioned herself with younger children when there were any around. The focused attention she brought to understanding how learning worked. The particular quality of her impatience with systems that didn't account for the different ways children arrived at knowledge. He knew why. He asked anyway because he wanted her to say it. "Because I know what it's like to be in a room where nobody is trying to teach you anything except how small you are," she said. "And I know what it's like when someone actually pays attention. Those are 2 different kinds of education, and I want to be the second kind." He nodded. "Right to apply," he said. Chet. She was accepted. She went. She came back for summers, and she wrote letters during the school terms that Agnes read aloud at the supper table in the evenings. Letters that were characteristically direct and observational and occasionally funny in the dry, understated way she had always been funny. Noticing the absurdity of things without performing the noticing. She graduated and came home for a season, and then took a teaching position in Thornfield, which was far enough to be independent and close enough to come back on weekends when the roads were passable. She taught the mixed-age school, 7 to 14, all of them, and she was, by the accounts that made their way back to Brennan through the ordinary channels of a small territory, good at it in the way that specific people are good at specific things, not because they do everything perfectly, but because they cannot stop caring about whether it works. She had a particular attention for the children who were quiet in the wrong way, the ones who sat at the back and had learned to make themselves small. She didn't make a production of noticing them. She just arranged things so they were seen, gave them questions they could answer, created conditions for small successes, kept the classroom as a room with the door open in the way that she had learned at 3 years old. Was the difference between a place you could be in and a place you had to survive. She also started writing. Not stories. She was not a fiction writer and didn't try to be. She wrote observations, analyses, arguments about educational practice, about institutional care, about the gap between what county welfare systems said they were doing and what they were actually doing. She sent some of it to a Cheyenne newspaper which published 2 pieces. She sent some to Hattie, who was now part of a territorial advocacy organization working on child welfare reform, and who wrote back, "You should come speak to the committee. I mean that." She went and spoke to the committee. She was 22 and she was nervous in the way that competent people are nervous about things that matter to them, which is to say, she was nervous and she spoke anyway, and she said what she had come to say with the precision and directness that had always been her mode. The committee listened, not because she was perfect, not because she had all the answers, or because her argument was flawless, but because she had something that people who have survived something real sometimes have, a particular authority that comes from knowing the subject from the inside, from being able to speak about what it costs in a way that isn't abstract. Agnes died in the winter of 1896. She was 83 and she had not been well since autumn, and she died in her room in the house she had kept for 27 years, in her own bed, on a Tuesday morning, which somehow seemed fitting. She had always been a practical woman, and she went practically. She told Brennan in October that she was slowing down in a way that wasn't going to reverse, told him what to do with her things, told him where she kept certain items he hadn't known existed, and then spent the remaining weeks being exactly herself. Difficult about some things, generous with the things she chose to be generous with, occasionally sharp in the way she had always been sharp, and present in the house with the specific gravity of a person who has decided to be present until they aren't. Mira came home from Thornfield when Brennan sent word, and she stayed for a month. She and Agnes had a final conversation that Brennan wasn't in the room for, and that Mira never told him the full contents of, which he respected. He knew it was complete because Mira came out of Agnes's room on that last visit with the expression of someone who has been given something. Not a thing you could hold, but something. And she didn't talk about it, but it was there in how she carried herself afterward. He found Mira in the kitchen the night after, sitting at the table where Agnes had sat for 30 years, hands flat on the wood. "I didn't know she was such a large part of what held things together," Mira said. "Until right now." "I know," he said. He sat down across from her. "I've been figuring that out too." They sat in the quiet of the kitchen, which was a different kind of quiet now, less inhabited. The fire was the same fire. The table was the same table. "She told me something," Mira said. He waited. "She said the thing about this family is that nobody in it had any business becoming a family, and it happened anyway." A pause. "She said that was the only kind worth having." Brennan looked at the table. "That sounds like her," he said. "It does," Mira agreed. The years ran. Mira's work widened. The 2 newspaper pieces became a small, steady body of writing. The committee appearances became a known quantity, and then a sought-after one. She worked with Hattie's advocacy organization formally from 1898 onward, contributing what she knew from the classroom and the visiting of institutions and the conversations with children and families who had passed through systems that were trying, with uneven success, to do better than the ones before them. In 1901, she helped draft a proposal for what she called a family placement framework, a structured system for identifying and preparing families capable of taking in children from institutional or crisis situations, with ongoing support and oversight that was designed to succeed rather than designed to catch failures. It was based on what had worked. It was also based on what hadn't. She was scrupulous about including the failures, the cases where placement had gone wrong, the families that hadn't worked out, because she had learned from Hattie that a framework that pretended to be perfect was a framework that couldn't be trusted. The proposal was presented to the Territorial Welfare Council in the spring of 1901. It was debated, revised, partially implemented, debated again. The process was frustrating and slow and required compromises she didn't always agree with, and she argued for what she believed was right and sometimes won and sometimes didn't and kept working regardless, because that was what work of this kind required. She got married in 1903 to a man named David Crane. No relation to Fielding, a coincidence she noted with dry humor in a letter to Brennan, who was a physician in Cheyenne and who had come to one of her committee presentations and afterward asked her 3 questions that were actually good questions, which was how she'd known he was worth talking to. He was not a perfect man, which she'd decided was a prerequisite rather than a drawback. He was steady and curious, and he disagreed with her with enough frequency to be interesting and enough respect to be worth disagreeing back with. They had 2 children, a boy named James and a girl they named Agnes, and Mira raised them with the same open doors and the same matter-of-fact attention and the same expectation that they would eventually learn to do things themselves that she had received in the ranch house north of Iron Hollow, passed forward in the way that things that were given without ceremony tend to be passed, quietly and with full intent. Brennan grew old. He stayed on the ranch, which was its own kind of answer to the question of what a person does with a life. The herd was smaller than it had been in the middle years. Managing it alone required adjustments he'd been making incrementally since Agnes died. But the land was the same land. The creek fed the same pastures. The east barn still caught wind from the wrong direction. Mira came back regularly. She brought David, and then James, and then Agnes the younger, and the house that had been very quiet in its inhabited by 2 quiet people way became periodically loud in the way houses get loud when children are in them. And Brennan moved through this changed condition with the equanimity of a man who had learned decades ago that the world changing around you was not a thing to be resisted. He was 71 when he had the first bad winter, the kind of winter that tells a body it's done with certain arrangements. He recovered, more or less, but came out the other side slower and with a new candor about what he could and couldn't do, which he applied to the ranch with the same practical accounting he'd applied to everything. Mira came and stayed for 2 months that year. She brought her work with her, correspondence, drafts, the ongoing machinery of advocacy, and worked at the kitchen table in the mornings before anyone else was up, which Brennan recognized as her mode from when she was 12 and doing homework in later 20 and writing her first pieces, and which told him she was still herself, which was the most reassuring thing she could have communicated. One evening, near the end of her stay, they sat on the porch in the late light, which was something they had been doing periodically for years, the two of them, without ceremony and without agenda. He said, "The framework proposal, the family placement system. Is it working?" She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was going to give him an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "Some of it," she said. "We have 43 families in the territory now operating under the framework. The support structure is better than anything that existed before. Children are staying placed longer with fewer disruptions." A pause. "It's still not enough. There are still facilities that operate on the old model, still counties where the oversight is inadequate, still children who fall through gaps that shouldn't exist." She looked at the pasture. "We're making the gaps smaller. I don't think we're making them disappear. Not in my lifetime." He thought about that. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "That it's not complete?" She turned to look at him. In the evening light, she looked for a moment like the version of herself that existed in the most specific part of his memory. Not the child on the platform, not the child behind the bed, but the one at the fence at 5 years old, her hand flat on the calf's back, learning that the world contained things that would stand still and let you touch them. "No," she said. "Incomplete and better is still better. I don't need it to be finished to know it matters." A pause. "You taught me that, actually. You didn't know what you were doing in that square. You didn't have a plan. You just did the next thing that was true." He looked at the grass. "I went to buy a horse," he said. She smiled. A real one, the kind that still arrived slightly sideways, the same way it always had. "I know," she said. "You've mentioned that." "I never got the horse." "No," she agreed. "You got something else." The sun was going down behind the western hills, pulling the light slowly out of the pasture, and the cattle were moving toward the water as they did every evening, and somewhere in the east barn the owl that Mira had first told him about 20 years ago, or its descendants, indistinguishable in the dark, was beginning its night. Brennan died in the spring of 1909. He was 73. He died on the ranch, which was where he had lived, which seemed correct. Mira was with him. She had come out from Cheyenne when it became clear the winter he'd had was a different kind of winter, and she was there at the end in the way that she had learned to be present for difficult things. Not talking over them, not performing around them, but in the room, with the door open. She buried him at the edge of the east pasture, near the spot she had chosen for Soot 30 years earlier, because she thought he would not have found the logic of that objectionable. She stood at the grave for a long time. She thought about a man who rode into a town square on a Tuesday morning with $57 in his pocket and a specific intention, and who came home with something he had not planned for and could not have predicted and spent the rest of his life not regretting it. She thought about Agnes at the kitchen table saying that the only families worth having were the ones that had no business being families. She thought about the rabbit with one ear, worn now to its thread and intention, sitting on a shelf in her house in Cheyenne, where her own daughter had asked about it once, and she had answered truthfully. She thought about all the children she had sat across from in classrooms and committee rooms and visiting halls, the ones who had the same quality of careful stillness that she recognized from the inside, the ones who had learned to make themselves small in rooms that demanded it. She thought about the work that was still unfinished, and the work that had mattered, and the gap between what was possible and what was real, which was the gap she had been working in for 20 years and intended to keep working in. People sometimes asked her, in interviews, in the question sessions after presentations, in the private conversations that followed public ones, what had made her do it? The work, the advocacy, the years of committee meetings and draft proposals and cases that didn't resolve cleanly and systems that changed slowly and sometimes not at all. She always gave them the same answer. She said, "Someone paid attention. That's all." Someone walked into a room where a decision was being made about a child and decided the child was worth paying attention to. The rest of it, the work, the years, the framework, the 43 families, and then the 103, and eventually more than she could track, all of it traced back to one person who saw what was in front of them and didn't look away. She always said it was not a complicated story. The complicated part was only the looking, the not looking away. Most people, she said, were capable of it. Most people just needed to be shown that it was possible. That you could walk into a situation you weren't prepared for, with no plan and no training and no certainty about the outcome, and simply do the next true thing, and then the next, and that this was sometimes enough. Not always. Not cleanly, but sometimes. More times than you'd think, if you were willing to start. She walked back from the grave through the spring grass, through the field she had known since she was 3 years old, and did not remember arriving in, but could not remember being without. The ranch was quiet around her, the cattle in the south pasture, the creek, the wind in the new grass, the same wind that had moved through this place for as long as anyone had been here to feel it, and would move through it long after. She went inside. There was work to do, and she intended to do it, and that was, in the end, the whole of what she had learned, that the work was not something you finished. It was something you chose. Every day, imperfectly, without certainty, you chose it. And that was enough. That had always been enough.